Welcome back, guys, to another episode of Digital Leaders Club podcast. So it's been a while, guys, but today we have Mark Frankel, who has worked within social media and marketing and journalism for the best part of 20 years. And yeah, today we're talking about social media communities and understanding more about what success looks like, what people are doing, and what other people can be doing and implementing in their own marketing strategies over the next year. So Mark, I was hoping you could introduce yourself to everybody.
Yeah, so hello, really excited to be here. I'm Mark Frankel, and as Jack just explained, I've worked in this field for some time now. I was a journalist for many, many years, working at the BBC, doing television and radio and online and digital social media. Ended up as in the newsroom, main newsroom of the BBC, doing UGC, user-generated content and social media. They're looking particularly at sort of breaking news events and citizen journalism and how to make our journalism as interactive as possible. And more recently, I've moved into the corporate world where I'm in a kind of content marketing role, trying to use my social media and storytelling experience to bring to a kind of corporate setting. So that's me.
And if we talk about social media, obviously social media when it comes to marketing is still fairly new, but it's gone through so many different developments over the past few years. And what have you seen since the early days of chat rooms to what we've got now with instant messaging on smartphones?
Yeah, well, I like to think of these things as a kind of series of phases. I mean, when I started in social media back in sort of 2011, if we can all cast our minds back that far, when Facebook was in its infancy, when there weren't as many social media platforms around as there are today, and as many chat apps around today, and mobile phone technology hadn't advanced to the extent that it has. People were still using BlackBerry Messenger. You remember that? So some of you will remember the London riots that hot summer many years ago, when people were organising through BlackBerry Messenger alerts, and that was the modus operandi for most of them. So that's kind of where I started to where we are today, which is an infinite number of ways in which people can share stories, share insights, communicate with one another in different both open and closed groups and communities. It's just an entirely different universe to the one where it started. But I think the one thing in common is this idea of it being a social universe. In other words, not being a kind of a binary conversation, but about people joining conversations that are circular. And I think in a way we've lost touch with what social media was really designed to be all about. When Mark Zuckerberg dreamt up the idea of Messenger in his dorm room at Harvard all those years ago, and others then followed suit, it was really all about sharing with your friends and your close associates what you were up to and what you were into. And what it fast became in those sort of 5 or 6 years ago was a very crowded and noisy universe where people shouted at one another about what they felt was important to them. And what I think happened is people stopped listening because they were more interested in the sound of their own voice than in what was actually coming back at them. And I think what's happened is there's been almost a kind of realignment in the last 2 or 3 years, as we've seen that trolling and abuse reached a kind of fever pitch on certain platforms, misinformation and the ability to find reliable and noteworthy sources on social media became ever more difficult. There's been a kind of a reappraisal of what social media is really about. And in a sense, what you've seen is people have wanted to return to that slightly quieter, more discreet environment from where they first started, or where social media first started. And that's why, in a sense, you've seen this pivot to privacy, as I like to see it, where a lot of the social media giants have started developing their platforms around communities and around that kind of private network of conversations that can be created. Facebook have done it with groups, and they've had all sorts of issues with how they've done it, but it's an onwards iteration for them. Twitter are doing it with Spaces, and more recently they've announced this forage into communities themselves. You've seen the same thing with different chat apps, of course, as well, with the emergence of Clubhouse and with people's use of WhatsApp and Messenger and so on, and even Instagram, where you can have private groups and conversations there. So I think what's happened is that social media has kind of matured. The universe is still very crowded, very noisy, very abusive. There's lots to distrust, but people are still drawn to it as a mode of communication. But what they're looking for is a slightly more intimate and more meaningful experience.
Yeah, I think you mentioned in the article you wrote for Reuters, which was a really good article, all about how the social communities and how people reacted within these social media community throughout COVID last year. I think you mentioned Mark Zuckerberg also mentioned that the future is kind of closed groups or private networks of social media communities where people can actually go and discuss, talk, whether it's to peer-to-peers or within their actual local or wider community. And I think it was a really interesting article, and it brought up so many really good points and made you think about where does the information that you're getting either from the media or from your social media communities come from, and how valid and how authentic is that information. And then it begin, as a person reading it or listening or looking at data, it then makes you scrutinize more than ever the kind of thing that you're digesting from even things outside of communities, whether it's just on a news site or on, if you're scrolling through your feed on Facebook or Instagram, for example. I was hoping you could talk to our listeners about that, just about what that article was about, and what you found from some of the things that you looked at back in, I think it was early to mid 2020.
Yeah, so last year I built on actually some research that I did a couple of years previous to that in 2018, when I was a research fellow at Harvard for a short period of time. And I'm really interested in this concept of community, that digital community, and how it can bring people both together in a real sense and give an audience the opportunity to find and discover stories that they wouldn't have otherwise discovered, and provide journalists and content marketers and others with opportunities they wouldn't find from the mainstream sources, be those press releases, politicians, business folk, and others who are providing information to them. I think there's a huge underserved audience in these places, and there's a huge underplayed opportunity for content marketers and for journalism. And so I was really interested in how that could be properly and ethically sourced. And there are issues and there are ways of approaching it, because you don't want to disrupt those conversations, and you don't want to just wade in without understanding how, the tone and the nature of these communities and how people interact and so on. So, and there's also a lot of misinformation, a lot of conspiracy theory, and a lot of things that you can get wrong. So as you rightly say, I mean, it's about verification. It's about understanding the nature of what you're experiencing, and about understanding the nature of the environment that you've put yourself in the first instance. So what I did last year is I decided to spend 2 or 3 months in the early part of the pandemic just looking at the coronavirus groups and communities that exist particularly on Reddit and Facebook. And I chose Reddit and Facebook because there was an enormous number of them on those two platforms, and they were largely organized around groups, which was, the focus of my research. It was, obviously there were other groups on WhatsApp that were playing out. There were other places that people were going to. And Nextdoor was also quite vibrant through this whole period. But I chose Facebook and Reddit because they were easy to get into, easy to research, and easy to analyze. And what I discovered was that yes, there was a lot of conspiracy, rumor, misinformation, people talking about 5G masts and, chlorine tablets and all sorts of things in relation to the pandemic. But there were also some really fascinating groups where people were looking to get reliable information. So, I talk in the research that I did about a home education group, for example, where parents were desperately trying to understand both the risks and benefits of continuing to send their kids to school. This was before the lockdown period when kids were withdrawn from school, and the benefit and risks of sending their children to school even when they continued to be allowed to do so, if their children had special needs issues or they had learning difficulties and so on. And they wouldn't necessarily have understood the things that they would need to do to keep themselves safe and maintain social distance and so on. And what I found fascinating is the government, were not actually providing very clear advice in a lot of cases in the early part of the pandemic, both to parents and to schools, about what should and shouldn't be the case. This was in the early stages where they were still formulating plans. And actually what you were seeing in some of these groups were a lot of the things that people felt very acutely that weren't being addressed. So as a jobbing journalist, you could think to yourself, well, actually this is a rich forum for understanding how to write up this story, or how to source the nature of the anxiety that people are experiencing in the pandemic. They wouldn't needed to, for example, to have gone door to door, knocking on doors to find out how people were feeling. They wouldn't necessarily have had to stand in the middle of a town centre that was in lockdown or going into lockdown, where people weren't necessarily walking past, and try to find people to talk to for Vox Pops. They could have actually just joined one of these communities, observed, listened to, engaged in some of the conversations, and had a fairly insightful understanding of those anxieties and those feelings. I found similar things on Reddit. I joined a number of groups on Reddit, and one of the fascinating things that I found, which I wrote about in the research too, was I found a number of people who were in China who were sharing their experience, first-hand experience of the authorities and the restrictions that they were living under in curfew and so on, that we were simply not able to see and understand ourselves, because journalists were being forbidden from moving around and asking questions and raising those kind of things. And of course, a lot of news organizations simply didn't have the footprint on the ground. And again, you could say, well, how can I trust this stuff? But again, in the course of the research, I go through all the verification techniques that I applied and that could be applied. And to a large extent, these were members of the public who were finding innovative ways of sharing what they were experiencing, either in diary form or by using the small amount of access that they did have to the internet and the social web in China, because so much of it is locked down, to maintain that kind of contact and to convey their stories. And provided you were using the right filters and you were sourcing and verifying things in a responsible way, doing your reverse image searching, cross-checking what they were saying against other news reports and so on, over time and over the 2 or 3 months that I was researching, you can start to build quite a fascinating picture of how people were moving around, the restrictions they were under, the things that they were experiencing. And the other thing I found very interesting was that when I went back to some of these first-hand testimony 2 or 3 months later, when I was writing up the report, quite a lot of the footage had been taken down, which I talk about in the report, because obviously the Chinese authorities are constantly monitoring for things that they would deem to be subversive or not helpful. So, that's another really interesting kind of dimension to this, because there I suddenly found myself in possession of first-hand testimony that no longer existed in the same form on the internet. So it's almost as if you were party to some kind of undercover investigation. Now, what you choose then to do with that information and how you can contextualize it and how you can then talk to it those are questions that would need to be discussed in the context of a newsroom with your editors and others. But I think it is fascinating, and there is a huge opportunity for those who are in the media industry to be more involved in these groups.
Is there anyone, I know we can get onto the marketing aspect of it, but just to look at the more kind of journalistic slant on it, are there any kind of news channels or journalists that you know who are utilizing, the benefits of online communities and abstracting first, reports from people to actually better understand what's going on, with people's lives throughout COVID?
Yeah, there are. I think some of the less traditional broadcasting organisations, I mean, my former employers at the BBC, they have some excellent journalists who work in this particular field, and they're monitoring the internet, monitoring social media all the time for stories, and they have the resource to do that. I think traditional media have tended to do this in a fairly traditional way, which is when a story emerges as a story, the journalists, then it's like sort of bees to honey. They then start to seek out more evidence of it in social media, or on social media and across the internet. I think those that are a little bit more fleet of foot and perhaps are using social media to source stories in the first instance, the BuzzFeeds, the Voxes, the Vices, those who have perhaps grown up in that environment where digital is their kind of mainstream, are a little bit less focused on being told about the story first, if you see what I mean. I think what I'd like to see is this being an opportunity for everyone equally. And I think what we're finding at the moment is that there are some organisations that naturally gravitate to this space because they feel that it's a great opportunity for sourcing original stories and first-hand accounts of things. And there are others who only see it as an opportunity to dive in when a story has already reached a kind of fever pitch. So say there's a breaking news story, a terror attack, a natural disaster of some kind, then there's a kind of rush to try and find the citizen journalism that can provide them with eyewitness testimony on that story. What I'd like to see more of, and I've spoken about this in the research that I've done in the past, is why can't these news organisations actually set their news operations up in such a way that they divert at least some of their attention to having reporters always in these groups and communities, so that they are actually sourcing material from this on an ongoing basis, rather than only trying to gain entry when it suits them.
And if we were to look at brands and businesses, so more from a marketing perspective, who would you say are utilising their own online communities or other online communities to market their product or service? Who would you say is doing it well?
Well, I mean, I don't want to sort of pick specific brands, but I think that there are clearly brands out there that are more aware of this as a I mean, I think it's more almost like a sort of programmatic marketing experience. So, what's interesting to me is during the pandemic, there's been a rush to gaming in a big way. And I think we've all spent a lot more time, or we obviously have spent a lot more time on screens than ever before. And what this has resulted in is lots more people playing games and chatting at the same time. So, Twitch has seen a huge explosion of activity, Discord as well. People are on, my kids on Minecraft all the time and so on. And I think what it does is that as you're playing a game, it gives brands that opportunity to advertise around and to insert themselves into the kind of narrative of that kind of gaming community with relevant or appropriate messaging. And I think those that have been more willing to take that step and maybe just step away from the classical brand advertising approach, which is banner ads, social media, influencer marketing, and think more about the kind of the user experience from a lockdown perspective, have been more able to at least do something that's going to hit through, or make more connection with people. So, I think those that have been willing to just think out of the box a little bit, or at least put themselves in the mindset of the consumer, who is not actually just sort of wandering down the street, or commuting to work and coming across stuff in the way that they would have done, say, pre-March 2020, have been more able to get their messaging in there in the right way.
And the benefits to most clients and most businesses, what would you say? How would you say that's developed over the course of the year in terms of the benefits for these social communities?
The benefits for the communities themselves, I think that there's really sort of two sides to this, because I think that some people are just getting a reinforcement of their prejudices in these communities, and I think that's one of the real risks, and I do talk about that in the research that I've done as well. There is a risk that you join a community and you just see a lot of the same stuff, which reinforces your biases, your prejudices, your sense of isolation or alienation from other perspectives. The ones that I think that have worked better have been where the moderators and administrators have been more active in rooting out what is either spammy or disruptive or abusive, and where the conversation has been of a real sort of threshold of quality. So the home education one is a really good example of a community that I joined, where it was just large enough for people to feel that they were making meaningful connections with people that they wouldn't have otherwise met, but the moderators and administrators were active enough to ensure that the conversations kept within the confines of what was appropriate, acceptable, relevant, important to everyone in the group. And that's not a small endeavor, because as a group kind of grows beyond a certain size, so those things become harder and harder. I mean, you get a group that's, say, 2,000-3,000 individuals, it's really very hard for anyone to control the conversation. So I think there is a kind of optimum level, really. And I did join some groups for the research, and I'm still members of some of these groups, where, the size of the group is, 10 into the tens of thousands. And actually you really can't control anything. So you see some things that are of value, but a lot of stuff that you just want to either ignore or, hope that somebody takes down. So you do have to navigate quite carefully.
I want to get your thoughts on Clubhouse. So obviously that's a brand new player to the market, and I've heard lots of mixed reports, a lot of glowing reports, and I just wanted to get your opinion on it and what your thoughts on Clubhouse as an overall social media tool.
Yeah, look, I think Clubhouse is fascinating. I think one of the probably the most interesting thing about Clubhouse is I always think when an app comes along that fills a gap in the market, the first thing that I think to myself is, why is there that gap in the market? Why is it that Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or, anyone else for that matter didn't come up with this themselves? And what's really interesting now is that they are, and they are, rather like, Facebook couldn't buy Snap, so basically try to build out all the features that they didn't have through Snapchat into Instagram and Instagram stories. You've got the same thing happening with Clubhouse and Twitter at the moment, where Twitter is announcing they're going into communities just as Clubhouse is taking off. So I think that what Clubhouse has developed here is exactly what I mentioned at the beginning, which is this sense of an urgent need that people felt for having the ability to be able to talk to like-minded people in a semi-closed environment, an invitation-only environment, where they wouldn't be abused or disrupted, and they could feel that they had the confidence and the ability and the time to share insights with one another and hear valuable stuff coming back to them. And I think it's slightly revealing in a way that Twitter were not able to provide that in the first instance. That Twitter has become this kind of monster of a kind of loudmouth back and forth conversation, which didn't ever provide that opportunity for private sort of filtered conversations. But I think that the challenge for Clubhouse is going to be, as soon as the app becomes less of a kind of exclusive club and more of a kind of bigger environment, will it lose the essence of its DNA? Because at the moment, I mean, I've been on to a number of chats in there, done a number of groups and rooms, and it's been a mixed bag. I mean, I've found that some have been really interesting, I've stuck with for a while. Others, I've just found it's people sort of talking for the sake of talking, and I've ditched out very quickly. I think there are a number of challenges that they already face. Firstly is, how do you discover the things not only that interest you, but that you would want to stick with for longer? I mean, at the moment it's a bit like sort of sticking a finger in the air. You put in a search term for a criteria, or you see somebody that you know who's on there, and you jump in. You've got really very little idea beyond that, and you have to stay with it for 5-10 minutes to understand whether you're going to really enjoy it. Is there going to be any capacity for people to rate different rooms, and so that, will they review certain communities within Clubhouse so that you will be more drawn in one to one or another, or will it remain this completely sort of flat democratic universe where you just have to find whatever you find? And then I think the other thing is, how much will Twitter and Facebook and others steal their thunder? Because Twitter have in a way, a competitive advantage just by their user base. And if they can, through their own communities, develop a more insightful version of the same thing, where you're more in control of what you want to see and what you want to join, and you're able to rate things in the way that I've just described, well, I think there's a risk that Clubhouse could burn itself out. But I've seen some really interesting things too. I mean, I shared something just yesterday on my LinkedIn, which I stumbled across, which was from Texas. And as we've all seen, Texas has been really suffering with that bad weather recently, and they had this incredible freeze and people lost power and so on. And I saw that a bunch of people had used Clubhouse to do some sort of charitable fundraising, where they had changed their profiles to the fundraising appeal, because of course you can't share links in Clubhouse. So they'd circumvented it by just changing their profiles and created groups to raise money effectively for people in Texas. And they'd actually been able to raise quite a considerable amount of money in a relatively short space of time. So I think there are some really innovative things going on within the Clubhouse community that aren't all about just people sharing what they know. They're also about, sort of citizen action of different kinds. And you could see a similar approach for, vaccine uptake, for example. I mean, I've seen a lot of, apps and local community groups being used for citizens in different communities to get together and help vulnerable people get vaccinated. I was reading about this actually just the other day, a whole group of people in the US getting together through Nextdoor and other apps and creating sort of neighborhood communities to help those that didn't have the ability to either drive themselves or get to vaccine clinics to get to those clinics. Well, you could see these apps being used as sort of activation tools in a way to try and encourage people to do things, or to build networks so that those that are in need are able to find the help that they need in order to do things. So there are other ways in which these communities can be really, really helpful.
What would you say is the best community that you're part of, just to get an understanding of what good looks like, I guess, and what keeps you within that community?
Well, I move around a lot. I mean, I've joined a lot of communities. I mean, I've found a number of Reddit communities that I've really enjoyed, but around niche interests, as well as, you know, sort of weird and wonderful stories, as much as around things that I'm into and interested in. And I've also found Facebook groups that I'm interested in. So I tend to not spend too much time in any one group. It kind of I depends on my mood, and depends what I'm looking at, and depends what I'm into at on any one day. But you know, I spent a lot of time in different coronavirus groups, partly for the research and partly because I was really interested to see what other people were making of the government's response to the pandemic, and what they were experiencing in different parts of the UK and so on. And it's really fascinating to me how much variation there is. And you get a sense of this in the group, where people are saying, well, you know, where I am in Middlesbrough, where, you know, all the schools are saying X, Y, and Z. Well, where I am in, you know, in Cardiff, it's all very different. And you get a sense of that on the news by just watching the mainstream media, but you get a lot more of a kind of granular, up to the minute sense of it by being in some of these groups, where you really get the disconnect of different local authorities and their interpretation of the guidelines.
And if you were to give any individual or a business any tips on how to build a successful community, what advice would you give them?
Well, I think you have to start with your objectives clearly, and there's no point having a community or trying to build a community if your objective is simply to try and understand one, you know, to get to one story or to get to meet one person. I mean, the point of a community is it's an ongoing evolutionary kind of process, and you need to maintain it over time. So if I was trying to create a group from scratch, the first thing I'd need to be able to persuade myself of is that I have the time and the resource to give it my attention over a period of time. Otherwise, it's just not going to be worth developing. Or, you know, are there people that could come in with me? Are there other administrators who could support me with that? I think the next thing would be, how do I ensure that, you know, as it grows, that I'm able to maintain the quality thresholds that we've been talking about? So what are the rules of the community? What are the guidelines of the community going to be? How will I ensure that people can contribute in the right way, that when the comments are properly moderated, that things don't become abusive or out of control? Will I set a threshold to the number of people that I will allow in? Or will I allow it to grow exponentially? And then how would I manage the conversation at that point? What will I ensure? What will my policies be in terms of people sharing other media, you know, video and pictures and so on? Will I have rules and guidelines there as well? So there are lots and lots of things that you need to think about. But I think once you've established those key objectives and those key kind of guidelines, it can be a really, really valuable experience. I mean, we set up, when I was at the BBC, I set up with some colleagues a number of Facebook groups, for example, that continue to be really big resource opportunities for BBC News. One that we set up linked to a family and education Facebook page all about single mums. And the objective there was that we were struggling at the time to get enough insightful, interactive content into BBC News from women who were struggling with childcare. And we were trying to do a whole series of stories from their perspective, and they were just were proving to be a difficult community for us to sort of engage in a more traditional way. And we set up this group, and I didn't set up, two colleagues of mine, two women in fact, and that's another thing, is getting the right people in the right place to set up the group. And they were able to, over time, through listening and building trust and so on, develop this community of single mums that became an incredible resource to BBC News. And they had very clear objectives. They were very persistent and very consistent about how they set about doing it. They were listening all the time, tolerant to different perspectives and points of view, but always very focused on the key objectives of the group. And they ended up with several hundred women in this group who were from a broad cross-section of backgrounds and from all over the country. And they become this most incredible focus group. So, it is possible to do these things, but you need to be very clear at the outset. I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, here we go. So, to finish off with, what would you say success looks like when it comes to the, in terms of a successful group?
So I think success is really defined by what your group is wanting to achieve in the first place. So if it was, as I just described with the single mums group that we set up at the BBC, that was about trying to create a group that would become a focus point for news stories. And their success was really defined by the fact that over time they were able to bring new perspective, and colleagues were able to build original news content off the back of their contributions. But another group may be all about building your brand awareness with an underserved community. So it could be that you have a product that you're struggling to engage a particular community with. You're really trying to get to people of a certain age or certain demographic in a particular part of the world or country. And so then your objective is, will this group actually help us to build awareness through sort of targeted advertising and the building up of the community alongside that in that way? So it kind of depends on your objective. Or in other words, for some people, it could be about dealing with, your experience of the pandemic. It could be a kind of self-help group for people who are struggling from a mental health perspective or from a learning perspective and are wanting to share tips and ideas about resources. So that could be another objective. So I think success is defined by the objective that you have for the group in the first instance.
Mark, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the chat, and what I'll do is provide the link to the article you wrote for Reuters in the bio for this podcast. And if anyone does have the time, I would highly recommend reading it. It's really, really, really good. And I will provide a link to Mark on LinkedIn if you want to connect with him and have a further discussion about social communities. But yeah, Mark, thank you once again. And hopefully speak soon.
Thank you very much for the time. Speak to you soon.